Thanks for watching our presentation, Perspectives on Content Modelling. My name is Phil Whittaker and I'll be giving the third perspective, having a balanced approach. But before that, we'll hear from Lisa talking about content design and Sam giving a developer's perspective. So let's begin with Lisa.
Perspectives on content design. My presentation is going to be in 5 main parts, and I'm going to talk about what content design is and then give some examples of different types of content. To help contextualise, I'm going to then talk about Nexa Digital's content model, and then I'm going to talk about content and poetry, and then a little bit about collaboration before I end. So, what is content design? This is what some other people have said about what content design is. Content design is answering a user need in the best way for the user to consume it. That was Sarah Richards. Another definition is content designers work to make services simpler, clearer, and faster for users. The final one here is, without words, our apps would be an unusable jumble of shapes and icons, while voice interfaces and chatbots wouldn't even exist. Words make software human-centered and require just as much thought as the branding and code. And that's from a really great book called Writing is Designing. And I think it was 2 guys work at Adobe, or at least one of them does. That's a really interesting book, interested in content modeling and content design. So content goes by a variety of names. It's called content, it's called content design, content strategy, and there are other ones that so it can be a bit confusing to what we mean by content. So we have to make sure that however we're working and whatever we're working on, we're clear about that. Because you'll get different answers when we ask different content designers. And I think the confusion and ambiguity in part comes from the fact that content is relatively new discipline in terms of being a recognised part of the workflow. It's not new by any means, but as a recognised part of design and development workflow, content is relatively new. And until recently, content had been usually left until towards the end of the design process. So what we do, we'd sort of make a thing, or we'd make things, and we'd leave the bits where the words and other content were going to be. We'd leave those bits blank, and we'd usually fill those spaces with the content designer's nemesis, which is lorem ipsum. So what are the types of content? And I've just got a list here. So content, usually when you say content design, people think about writing for the web. And certainly content is words and numbers, but content can also be visual imagery, and that's moving and still imagery. It can be audio, whether that be the human voice, music, sound effects. Content is also data and information. It's information architecture and navigation. It's taxonomy and nomenclature. And it's metadata, like alt text, categories and tags. And it's also something that we're looking at in Nexa Digital, which is asemic content design, which is asemic means without words. We're thinking about when we don't use words or content and the negative space in a content design. So content is what we don't say as well as what we do say in a design. And that's a relatively new part of our practice that we're exploring at the moment. So that's a variety of things that content can be and is. And so Nexa's content model is collaborative and iterating, really is the first thing to say. And that Nexa will recognise that content is a discipline and a practice in its own right. And also that the content is our content practice is part of a non-linear and collaborative design process. So not only do we work collaboratively within our content team, there's 3 of us in the team, we also collaborate with the wider design team. And everyone in the Nexa team is familiar with the dual content model we work from within our content team. And so our dual content model, the content we make and work with consists of 2 main kinds, and this helps us to understand where we fit in a project and what we can bring to it and what our limitations are. And that we call these 2 types of content in the content model our body content and UX content. And by body content, we mean the words, data, information that a user visits a website or app for. So that's actually their destination. When a user goes to a website, they navigate towards something that they need or want to look at, want to use, want to consume. And that's what we call body content. And that can be a blog post, it can be a map, it can be a list of things, it can be some data, it can be tables. but the user has gone to a place to find this content, and that's the body of the website or app. And the UX content is the parts of the design which help the user get to what they need and what they want to find. And that is all the things that I mentioned before. So it's the microcopy, it's the breadcrumbs, it's the labels, it's the tags, it's the navigation, it's the CTAs, it's all that small writing and content that helps the user get to where they need to be. So it's not the main body of a website or an app, but it's just as important, because without it, the user couldn't find their way to where they want. So that's how we practice content in Nexa. We see our content practice as working with body content and UX content. And in this dual content model, really the implication is that we're all content designers and makers, regardless of our job title. Because really, users don't care about our team names or our job descriptions. Users don't care about how we do or what we do, and users only really care about their needs. And in a human-centered, user-focused design process, we all really make things that address user needs. And in that context, of it is human-centered and UX-focused context, we really are all content producers, regardless of our job title within a design team. So another perspective which sort of illuminates this a little bit is content and poetry. And I'm a poet and a creative writing scholar, and there's other poets and journalists on our content team, but also in Nexa, some of the senior management and longer certain team members are very experienced commercial and technical authors themselves. So we kind of built our content design team on this excellence in user research, user experience, and sort of underpinned by good knowledge of writing for technical and commercial applications and environments. And so what's that got to do with poetry? We specialise in words and language in our content design. And as I say, we bring a variety of approaches to that. And really one of the first definitions of microcopy, which is those small bits of UX writing that I was talking about before, I think the first definition was by a really famous poet called Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who lived in the 18th century. And he said that prose is words in their best order, whereas poetry is the best words in the best order. And that's the same is true of when you're working in content. The word order, the syntax, the grammar is incredibly important, as it is in coding and in other parts of the design process. So really the relevance of poetry is not overstretching the connection. There's a lot going on which is similar between code and poetry and design, and that's something we embrace at Nexa, and we use it to explore our content practice. So we see poetry as code, and we see code as poetry, and that's something we actually really believe in and are committed to. And it's not just us. There's a community of practice that is interested in the semantics of poetry as well as code. And there's a dev who works in Netflix called Angus Kroll, and that's the cover of his book, If Hemingway Wrote JavaScript. And it's a really interesting book. So Angus Kroll is an avid reader, and he's written this book, and I think he's writing code of the Fibonacci sequence, but in the style of different writers. So he does the code in the style of Ernest Hemingway, and that's very lean, truncated, staccato code. And then he rewrites the same thing as if it was written by Virginia Woolf, and that's a long stream of consciousness type of code. And it's a lot of the book is lost on me because I'm not an expert coder, but it's a very interesting look at how we can approach the same problem from lots of different ways, and that's what a poet does as well. And so literature, including poetry, has a lot of resonance with coding. So this poetry, like code, has lines, indents, syntax, grammatical operators, there's form rules, strict structural protocols. That's unless it's free verse, in which case you can write anything basically. But there's lots of similarities. And Hemingway wrote what's called the world's shortest story, and it's only 6 words and 3 full stops. And it's the brevity of the story that that we're interested in content, and that Angus talks about in this book. So if you're interested in sort of different perspectives on content modelling, then I recommend this book, especially if you actually can understand it from a coder's perspective. I watch coders reading it and they really enjoy it. And this is an example of a collaboration I did with a dev, and it's a piece of code which we've just put in a panel, and we called it a code poem, and it's a collaboration that was celebrated the birthday of Alan Turing, and it was well received when I think we shared it a couple of years ago now. And that was myself and a coder working to just produce something small that we could do for that event. So to wrap up, I think the thing that matters rather is how people interact with what we make. And I've already said that I think we are all content designers on one level. We're not just that, but we are that. And I think content and programming are both arts, and content and code belong together and are really poetic by their nature. Because poetry is just the ordering of words, grammar and sound into something that can be experienced by somebody else. And I think that is tied up with the user's feelings, how they interact with something emotionally, as well as how they use something. And finally, really, collaboration is the key in content. And at Nexo, we're on a mission to really show the lorem ipsum word dump the door. That's absolutely, I said it was on Nemesis, we don't want to be using lorem ipsum. And how we do that is to collaborate. And what that looks like really is that we are in agile and multidisciplinary teams, and that content's always included from the planning and ideation stages onwards. And that's something that we're working on at Nexo now. We work like that now, and we're developing that. And that's the end of my presentation, and that's my contact details. And thanks for listening.
I'm Sam Flanagan, and it's really good to be here today at this virtual Codegarden. I've been building websites for over 20 years. I've built and inherited a lot of Umbraco websites during that time, some of them quite large and complex. Today, I'm going to try and give a quick 10-minute overview of content modelling and how it might be applied to an Umbraco CMS project. This particular online format actually has an extra degree of suspense because the children could come through this door at any moment and steal the show. But let's see how we get on. Ultimately, all models will eventually end up being wrong in some way, but some are useful. It's more important to be pragmatic and find an approach that is lightweight and allows your team to move fast rather than becoming embroiled in analysis paralysis. So what is a content model? The wisdom of Google tells us that a content model represents content in a way that translates the intention, stakeholder needs, and functional requirements from a user experience design into something that can be built by developers implementing a CMS. So in a way, a content model is a map or a blueprint or a bridge that takes us across the yawning crevasse of doom that lies between intent and implementation. We usually create content models with the intention of documenting information about types, attributes, relationships, and rules. But not all models contain information about all of those things. One of the most common models that we come across are sitemaps. Sitemaps provide a useful high-level overview of content, but don't go into much detail about attributes or relationships. Wireframes provide useful information about layout, but can be quite limited in terms of identifying types, attributes, and certainly relationships and validation rules. When it comes to more detailed planning for individual content types, Excel spreadsheets can be a really useful tool for nailing down full lists of attributes, individual field types, and validation rules. And UML models allow us to model pretty much everything in quite high resolution, including types, attributes, validation rules, relationships, and cardinality of content. A good content model can play a key part in improving collaboration and communication between different stakeholders. Sometimes large organizations can simply lose track of what content they have, and a model gives a better understanding of content. It can also identify who owns content and how that content should be reviewed and governed, and develop metrics for reporting things like expiry and review dates for content. Identifying content types and attributes at an early stage of a project can be really helpful for content designers. It can allow them to produce useful example content and not fall back on generic lorem ipsum. Project managers can refer back to a content model as a reference point to gain stakeholder consensus and as a check to ensure that a CMS implementation meets the original intent of the project. For developers, the content model becomes a blueprint for implementing CMS document types. It's also an opportunity to identify opportunities to reuse content across different channels, mobile, content APIs, etc. For content editors, the content model provides an opportunity for a guided authoring experience where they are able to focus solely on the content and not be distracted by presentation or technical concerns. So assuming we've managed to design a really good model that everybody's happy with, the next phase will be to get our development team to translate that model into CMS document types. And there's really 3 different ways that this can be done. The first approach is what I like to call the blob, or the generic content page. And essentially this is where we decide we have to give up on translating the model into the CMS, either because it's too difficult or because we haven't been given enough information. So at this point we enable every button on the rich text editor and leave all organization, structuring and formatting to the content editors, which can end up being quite confusing for them. The bigger the team of content editors, the more likely it is that someone will start using Comic Sans fonts and inserting emojis all over the place. And without any guidance on structure coming from the CMS, entropy will quickly set in. Secondly, we sometimes see CMS implementations that take a layout-centric approach. So document types and attributes are named after layout aspects, so after rows, columns, side panels, etc. And equally, this can become confusing for content editors because when they come to creating new content, rather than being presented with a list of meaningful sort of names, they're given a list of layout templates in effect, so they don't know which template to use for which type of content, and this again can be quite confusing in the long term. And third, we have the content-centric approach to CMS building, and here we approach building document types in a similar way to building a relational database. In effect, we're using Umbraco to build our own database of content, with semantic naming for document types, granular attributes, validation, relationships, and cardinality constraints. Anne Rockley says that giving content this kind of structure sets you free. Free to share the content with other systems, such as mobile apps and content APIs. Free to manipulate and process content more easily with code. And frees content managers to focus only on content and not be weighed down with concerns about structure, presentation, and technical issues. To summarize the benefits of content modeling and a content-centric approach to CMS building, we can see that it encourages an upfront thought about content, promotes a shared understanding of content among stakeholders, gives developers a blueprint for CMS document types, improves the business's ability to control and measure content, and is in fact required approach if we're going to use headless CMS and content API integrations. And the really good news is that Umbraco has a great set of tools to support a content-centric modeling approach. Umbraco gives us pretty much all the tools we need to accurately translate detailed content models into a CMS implementation. So for anyone who hasn't looked at any of these features in depth or hasn't considered using them in quite this way before, I highly recommend looking at custom document types, attributes and custom property editors, validation rules, and relationship and cardinality constraints. These features all within Umbraco. Thank you and enjoy Codegarden.
And now it's time for my perspective on content modelling. And I'm interested in taking a balanced approach. I think content modelling is really, really important, and Sam's talk was really, really relevant, and I've had loads of interesting information in it. But I worry that solely focusing on getting the correct content model would really negatively impact on the rest of the system, because we're talking about a full system here with lots of different people with different abilities and different skills contributing to it. And by solely concentrating on the content model, then things could go wrong, or you could impact on other people's working processes and ideas. So if we look through how content flows through a CMS as the first step. So we start with the raw content, which is what's either created or provided to the content author. And then they take this and they convert it into whatever content model you have defined in the system. That gets mapped into a presentational model, which then gets rendered into the web page or the design. And the problem with that is if you have a content model that's wildly different than the presentational model, it's very difficult for the content author to, when they're converting from that raw content into the content model, to understand what they're actually doing, to have some relevance. And much further away from the design that the content gets, the harder it is for the content author to understand what it is you're actually creating, they're actually creating. And there's another part to this as well. As well as the content model, I heavily believe that there's a content authoring model that's also attached to that. So you can't get away in a CMS from just having lots of different bits of structured data. You always end up with editing tools that generate some content that relate to the design. This is down to the size of the system, the amount of different channels that the content is going to go through. But you're always going to get scenarios where people are wanting to define how things look on the page. And then you end up with design settings, things like page builders, grid builders, and rows. There's lots of circumstances where those are applicable, and content modelling really is not a black and white art. It's very much a grey scenario. You've got to take a best case for each individual scenario that you come across. And as just said, design implementation is really, really important, because it's not just the content author that you're looking after here. There is a design that you've got to consider and what it looks like at the other end, unless you do a lot of work into understanding what that is. But those budgets are few and far between. So I wanted to have a look at some components that we've used in our sites at Hi-Fi. And the first one is a data-led component. So what I'm looking at here is the difference between design-led and data-led. So if we look at the data-led, this is very much a led from what it is. So it's a series of headshots that are attached to a person, to a member of the team or the board of directors in this case. And it's very important to realise that data is very much tied to what it is. But if we look at the other side, then the problem is that this is a design fragment. This is a design construct. And this data in here could be anything, really. It could have completely different data in there, and it could be shared around the site. And if you tie the data to what it is, then you end up tying yourself in all sorts of knots, and it becomes very difficult to manage the data for the content author to understand what data what they're actually doing with the site without seeing what the actual outcome is going to be. And this goes even further. So here at Hi-Fi, we're really interested in and do a lot of narrative and storytelling within our websites. And And if you take the content modeling too far, then our feeling is that you end up with lots of the structured data that sits in a big bag somewhere and isn't really tied to what it is. And in that case, in our case, a lot of the time it's narrative. It's carefully understanding the intent of the user and guiding them through a story to make sure that they can understand and react in the right way and hopefully contact us. And when you have data that's just in a big bag, then it's very difficult to appreciate and fine tune it. So in this case, what we have here is a collection of images and RTEs that are tied together to tell a story and to provide a flow to the page. Moving on to the next is we very much believe in designing in CMS. So a lot of designers, they develop patterns, they develop design systems, which is what we're interested in at Hi-Fi. And we find that sometimes those designs take a long time to produce. And even with the tools like Figma and Sketch and other programs which are component-led. And sometimes it's a lot easier if you provide the right tools to the designer, then they can use that as content authors themselves to design in page, and it'll be a much quicker process for them to do that. And it also ties them into their design system. They can't really go off in a wild flight of fancy when creating their designs. It makes everything standardized, which is kind of the purpose of the design system and design patterns within the system. So implementing your content model and getting the balance right is a difficult thing. It's something that Umbraco does reasonably well. We really like the recent implementation of the block list editor and using that to allow us to provide what we call inline data, so data that's very much tied to a page, to a thing, and then be able to also link out to global content data, which can be your unstructured things that can be reused around the site wherever you want to. And having that fine balance makes Umbraco a really, really interesting content management system for us. And then finally, I wanted to talk about mapping the content model in Umbraco to the presentational model, because this is something that's very close to how we think. And we use mapping tools to accomplish that and to automate that process. Because it can be very complicated. There can be lots of different components and lots of different properties and lots of different modes on each of those components. And keeping that mapped is a very difficult thing to do. So by automating it, we make it easier to manage the system as we go on and understand what is global, what is a global item, what is an inline item, and how to split things up into groups or tabs that are now coming back. Because what we want to achieve is what we like to call parallel lines. And it's parallel lines that's mapped, that's morphed into the content model underneath. And by understanding this in a great way, in a really easy to manage way, then we reduce the plumbing code that goes into taking the things from the content management system and then putting them onto the page. And that's really, really important to us to speed up our production and to make things long term, which is what we're interested in. So in conclusion, content modeling is really, really important, but it shouldn't be the dominant course. It should be really balanced with the other considerations, the content authoring considerations, and all the other people, the designers that are involved in the production of the site. And that's it really for my perspective. We'll be happy to take any questions in the panel after this section of talks. Thank you.